You know those picture-perfect cooking videos where everything turns out amazing? Yeah, well, this isn't one of those. In fact, my journey into the kitchen started off as a complete disaster. My name is Marletta, and on this channel, I teach cooks of all skill levels how to use peppers to enhance and not overpower the dishes that they make. So, from frying a stewing hen to creating the world's thickest hot mustard, I think I've made just about every cooking mistake in the book. And today I'm bearing my soul and I'm sharing my most epic kitchen fails so you can laugh with me or at me and maybe learn what not to do. Stick around because some of these are so bad, especially number 10, they'll make you feel like a master chef in comparison. Let's start with one of my earliest mistakes. When I was a kid, I had no real interest in cooking, so I never learned how to cook. My mom was a great cook, and I kind of just left it up to her to do everything. I got married in the late 60s, and at that time, there wasn't any such thing as internet, and at the time, we only had 3 television channels, so cooking shows didn't even exist. All I had was my good old Betty Crocker cookbook. One evening, my new husband and I decided to have my in-laws over for dinner, and I decided I'd make fried chicken. Up to that point, I'd never made fried chicken, so I turned to my trusty cookbook and followed the instructions to the letter. I figured, how hard could it be to fry a chicken, right? Well, it turns out it's very hard when that chicken is actually a stewing hen. If you don't know, a stewing hen is meant to be cooked low and slow, like in a soup or a stew, because the meat is very, very tough. I guess it's called a stewing hen for a reason, right? But there I was, frying away, thinking I was making something absolutely delicious. It smelled really good. My father-in-law bit into a chicken breast and almost choked. He said it was like chewing on leather. And bless his heart, even he knew that you shouldn't fry a stewing hen. Lesson learned, not all chickens are created equal. Did you know that baking powder and baking soda are not the same thing? Well, I'm sure you do. But when I first started cooking, I sure didn't. One day I was making a batch of cookies and accidentally swapped one ingredient for the other. The result? Well, instead of light and tender cookies, I had something that resembled little bricks. It turned out that baking soda needs an acid to activate, while baking powder already has the acid built in. I didn't know that. That was a hard, no pun intended, and very crunchy lesson to learn. Now, let's talk about measurements. You'd think reading a recipe would be pretty straightforward, right? That is, until you accidentally turn a perfectly good dish into something that resembles a salt lick. One time, I misread a recipe and used 1 tablespoon of salt instead of 1 teaspoon. Big difference. Now, in a way, that might not sound like a big difference, but trust me, it is. The moment I took a bite, I knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just salty, I think it was saltier than the ocean. I tried to salvage it. I added more ingredients. I diluted the flavors. I even said a little prayer. But there was no saving this disaster. It was inedible, and I had no choice but to dump the whole thing and start over, this time reading the measurements very carefully. The moral of the story, always double check your measurements, unless you're secretly trying to preserve yourself like some salt-cured ham. Have you ever made a cake and forgotten to add the eggs? Well, I have. And let me tell you, it was not one of my finest baking moments. I was really excited to make a homemade cake from scratch rather than something out of the box, so I thought I'd give this a whirl. Again, using my trusty Betty Crocker cookbook, I carefully measured out the flour, the sugar, and all the other ingredients. I mixed everything together. It wasn't quite as moist as I thought it would be, but I popped it in the oven and waited for the magic to happen. Well, like any time you're baking a cake or really anything, the kitchen smelled amazing, and I was already picturing this perfect fluffy little cake that I'd be serving later that day. And then I pulled it out of the oven. But instead of a soft, moist cake, I was met with something that looked and felt like a dense, crumbly brick. Confused, I ran through the recipe in my head. That's when it hit me. I had completely forgotten the eggs. What's worse is they were still sitting on the counter. I tried to convince myself that it still might be edible. Oh no. One bite and it was clear. This was not a cake. This is a lesson in why eggs matter. And even with the price of eggs today, you still got to add them in a cake. My result, or my cake, was dry, it fell apart instantly, and had all the charm of sawdust. Now, I always double check my ingredients because once is enough to learn that eggs are not optional in cake baking. Making chili? Great. Not soaking your beans? Nah, not so great. In today's age, we have things like Instapot, and that's okay. But back then, I learned this the hard way when I decided to whip up a big pot of homemade chili. I had all my spices ready, my tomatoes were simmering, and my beans, well, let's just say I got a little overconfident. As I recall, I was running a little late, and I figured, why bother soaking the beans? I'd heard people say you could just cook them longer and they'd be fine. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity of simmering, I grabbed a spoonful to taste. Oh my gosh. Instead of soft, creamy beans soaking up all that delicious flavor, I crunched down on something that had the texture of a slightly undercooked peanut. And that's not exactly what you want in a warm, comforting bowl of chili. But I was desperate. I kept cooking, hoping they'd soften up. I added more broth, I turned up the heat, I even tried mashing a few of the beans along the side of the pot. By the time I finally admitted defeat, my chili was more of a thick stew with tiny, edible pebbles than the rich, hearty dish that I had envisioned I'd be serving. Lesson learned, back then anyway, soak your beans. Unless you enjoy a jaw workout with your chili, trust me on this one. If you don't soak your beans, then make sure you've got an Instapot on hand. Now, you probably know that rice expands when it cooks, right? Well, back when I was first starting to learn how to cook, I didn't know that. So one evening I was making dinner and I decided to cook some rice as a side dish. How hard can it be, right? I grabbed a small saucepan, the one that looks just about the right size for the amount of dry rice that I had. I figured it's just a little rice. How much bigger could it get? As it turns out, rice gets a lot bigger when it cooks. A few minutes in, as the water started bubbling, I kind of noticed the rice creeping up the sides of the pan. I thought, no big deal, it'll settle back down, right? It didn't. Before I knew it, my stove had turned into something that looked like Mount St. Ricemore. There were fluffy little white grains that had poured over the sides of the pan, like lava hissing and sizzling as they hit my burner. I panicked. I tried to stir the rice back down, but that only made things worse. The rice was sticking to the spoon, the pot, to the stove, to me. It was kind of like a full-on grain invasion. By the time I wrestled the pan off the heat, my kitchen looked like a rice explosion had taken place. And cleaning sticky, overcooked rice off of a hot burner, oh my gosh, that is not fun. Let's just say I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. So, another lesson learned, always use a bigger pot than you think you need. And maybe keep a mop handy, just in case. Now, this next one is actually more of a mystery than it is a fail. I was baking biscuits from one of those pop-open cans, the kind that you bang on the side of the counter and it scares the crap out of you when they explode open. Well, I popped the can open and there were supposed to be 8 biscuits, but as I separated the layers, I could only find 7 biscuits. I figured that I simply didn't separate the dough correctly, which has happened before. I baked the 7 biscuits and that was it. Well, fast forward about 8 months to when I was moving out of my apartment. I was sitting on the floor cleaning my oven, and I just happened to look up at the ceiling, and guess what I found? Yep, my runaway, or maybe I should say my flyaway biscuit, was on the ceiling. And let's just say that poor little biscuit had seen better days. I love a little heat, but I took it way too far when I first tried making habanero jelly. Now, this actually happened just last summer. Now, here's the thing about habaneros, and you probably know this, but they pack a serious punch. I didn't quite measure them properly, and I ended up with a jelly that was so spicy, I think it could have melted steel. Man, I'll tell you, one tiny taste, and I was running for milk like my life depended on it. The moral of the story? When dealing with habaneros, less is definitely more. This one happened just last week. My son's coworker gave him a jar of hot mustard that was absolutely delicious. I managed to get the recipe from the lady and thought I would try and make my own. Well, what the recipe didn't mention, however, was that you need to blend the ingredients for a full 90 seconds at high speed. Now, you wouldn't think that would be a big deal, but given the ingredients that were in the recipe, yeah, that's what you had to do. I didn't. I just blended them until they were blended. And instead of smooth, spreadable mustard, I ended up something closer to dried peanut butter. It was thick, unspreadable, and completely unusable. The takeaway when you're getting a recipe from someone, make sure that you have all the instructions before diving in. This last one is one that my kids talk about over and over, and it all happened before they were born. They refer to it as my most hilarious cooking screw-up and never seem to hesitate to share the story with others. My first husband's mother was an excellent cook, and she was particularly good at making homemade bread, and she made cinnamon rolls that were to just die for. Well, when I got married, I thought I would impress my new husband with my culinary skills, and I decided to make his mom's famous cinnamon rolls. Now, keep in mind, my baking repertoire up to this point was making cookies and cakes, and as you've already heard, even that was challenging, but that was it. But in this case, I had everything mixed and rolled out the dough and was preparing to spread the brown sugar and cinnamon. I opened up the can of cinnamon and sprinkled some on the dough and noticed that the cinnamon was green. I had never made anything with cinnamon before, maybe other than cinnamon toast, and I thought that perhaps it changed colors as it was cooking. So I asked my hubby, who was in another room, "Hey, what color is cinnamon?" And he said green. I shrugged my shoulders and thought, well, that's what I've got. So I went ahead and slathered a boatload of cinnamon on the dough and put everything in the oven. Well, you know how cinnamon rolls smell when they're baking. The kitchen smelled amazing as these rolls were in the oven getting ready to do their thing. Well, when they came out of the oven, I put a couple on a plate and proudly took them into my hubby. Well, he took a bite, choked a few times, and said, "What's this green stuff?" I said, "It's cinnamon," and I reminded him that he told me that cinnamon's green. His response was classic. He said, "Well, you asked a stupid question, so I gave you a stupid answer. Everyone knows that cinnamon is red." Well, in my defense, as it turned out, the can of cinnamon that I used was in fact labeled cinnamon, but what we later found out was that the spice company, a very well-known one in fact, had shipped an entire case of sage in cans labeled as cinnamon. I was the only one in our little town with a population of less than 500 that didn't know what sage was. And you might know that word travels fast in a small town, and soon it seemed that everyone was having a good laugh at my expense. By the way, hubby and I are no longer married. So those are just a few of my biggest cooking disasters, and trust me, I have plenty more. As you can see, I still make mistakes every now and then, and things don't go always as planned. But here's the thing, every mistake in the kitchen, or in life for that matter, teaches you something. I've had my fair share of kitchen disasters over the years, but you know what? I still became a really good cook. And honestly, these mistakes make for some of the best stories. Cooking and life isn't about being perfect. It's about learning, adjusting, and having fun along the way. And sometimes even being able to laugh at yourself. So if you ever have a kitchen fail, don't sweat it. Just keep going. And before you know it, you'll be turning out some amazing dishes too. Now, I want to hear from you. What's your biggest kitchen fail? Let me know in the comments and let's all laugh and learn together. And hey, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more cooking adventures, hopefully with fewer disasters. See you next time.